Ink on the alliance with Russia barely dried. Napoleon departed Tilsit on July 9, 1807. By 3 a.m. the next morning, he was installed in the royal chateau in Königsberg. There he stayed for a few days before passing through Berlin onto Dresden by July 17th. Empress Josephine was kept up to date on his progress. Quote, "I have reached Dresden yesterday at 5 in the evening. I was 100 hours in my carriage without getting out. Here I am guest of the King of Saxony. By the time you read this letter, I will be halfway back to you. One of these fine nights I shall turn up at Saint-Cloud like a jealous husband. Be warned." Vital work delayed Napoleon's progress, installing Jérôme as King of Westphalia, establishing the Continental system in the Baltic, organising the garrisoning of Prussia, negotiating with Denmark, among many, many other things. Through it all, Napoleon ached to return home. He hadn't seen France in 10 months, his dear Josephine just as long. He mailed in a letter from July 7th how eager he was to reacquaint himself with the good Baron Kempen. By July 27th, the Emperor had returned to France. One minute, Parisians were opening their daily edition of Le Moniteur to read about Napoleon and Alexander forming an alliance at Tilsit. The next, Notre Dame was thudding with a Te Deum sung in celebration of the Emperor's return. The mayor of Paris tried to organise some grand celebration for this illustrious return, but Napoleon simply ordered his carriage plough straight through. He made straight for Saint-Cloud, where he and Josephine spent the night. The next morning, the Conseil d'État, the Council of State, was convened. Work carried on essentially where Napoleon left off, as though he'd never left. In many ways he really hadn't. Though far away on campaign, Napoleon was fully in the loop. He received detailed, usually daily reports from ministers of state. They, in return, were a formidable team that managed France effectively in the Emperor's physical absence. The economy was jointly stewarded by Minister of the Treasury, Charles Molien, and Minister of Finance, Charles Godin. A similar dynamic duo, Guillaume Clerc, Minister of War, and Pierre Deroux, Inspector General, kept La Grande Armée's administrative and logistic networks running smoothly. Politics were kept in check by Jean-Baptiste Champagny, Minister of the Interior, and Hugues Bernard Maret, Secretary of State. Behind the scenes lurked Joseph Fouché, Minister of Police, who maintained France's extensive network of spies as well as its counterintelligence operations. Foreign Minister Charles-Maurice Talleyrand, though still in Berlin soothing Prussian feathers matted by Tilsit, was soon to return to France. And looming over all was the inestimable Jean-Jacques Cambacérès, Chancellor of the Empire and Napoleon's hand-picked proxy, there to manage domestic affairs when the Emperor could not. The most significant change since Napoleon left France in mid-1806 was a righting of French finances. Quite unlike his return to France in 1805, when Napoleon found state finances in peril, reform and modernisation had led the French economy to be the healthiest it had been under his rule. Godin and Molien's major reforms to the financial and tax systems were reaping dividends. Tax and tariff incomes were up, the consumer economy, especially in luxury goods, was booming, and the agricultural sector was slowly, if steadily, modernising. Even before the defeat of the Prussians, confidence in the French economy was rising, as evidenced by the soaring value of government bonds. In April of 1806, the Bank of France issued bonds at 6% interest. Victory in Germany, the Peace of Tilsit, and finally the 153 million franc indemnity paid by Prussia to France saw the value of a single bond rise precipitously, capping out at 93 francs, over 5 times more than it had been in 1800 when Napoleon assumed the consulship. Later the price would stabilise in the mid-80s, only to decline again as the war with Spain broke out. Napoleon ordered Molien to capitalise on these higher values, cashing in the bonds the French government had in the Kingdom of Italy for a hefty payout to be added to the annual budget. Napoleon was also quick to capitalise on the propaganda value of a healthy economy, ordering Fouché to publish endorsements of government fiscal policy. Quote, "Have articles written by men well versed in the finances of the Ancien Régime, reminding everyone of what is already known, that in times of peace under the Ancien Régime, government securities were not traded at less than 6%. It is necessary to convey the extent to which the branches of finance were subjected to abuses and squandering, and to contrast this disorder with the rigour and order introduced today." It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, though. Napoleon rode Molien and Godin hard on the budget for 1807. From Finkenstein back in April, Napoleon could have walked to Paris without muddying his boots with the deluge of letters he sent demanding updates, reports, and corrections on the budget. I'll spare you the details, just take my word that it's Napoleon at his most anal. No minister was spared when it came to money. Fouché was chastised for failing to pay out for maintenance on roads and bridges until the seasonal labour was gone, raising labour costs by, in Napoleon's estimate, 200,000 francs. Whether it be Molière overpaying for travel arrangements to America, or Carbonnières giving out too many free tickets to the opera, the amount was not the point. Waste and inefficiency were. Napoleon asserted his financial ethos succinctly to Fouché. Quote, "The budget is my law. It must be followed because finances, in all branches of administration, are my primary concern." Budgeting was close to Napoleon's heart as it affected his ability to pay the army on time and in full. La Grande Armée had been paid haphazardly during the Polish campaign, leading to widespread discontent. Napoleon reported the pay arrears to the Treasury. "Monsieur Morion, it has been a long time since you last reported on pay. Please inform me what is owed to the Grande Armée in pay, and what amount of money you have in reserve for this purpose, based on the expenses of 1806. Also, please inform me what the pay for the Grande Armée would amount to for the months of January, February, and March. When I receive your report, I will issue a decree to relieve my treasury of the obligation to pay part of this pay." Morion got the ball rolling by digging into the public treasury and some supplemental funds, but Napoleon was concerned that this was unsustainable. The expenses for the army were extreme, well over 200 million francs annually. Going forward, he insisted as much pay as possible come from the domaine extraordinaire, conquered or subjected lands outside of France. In the case of the Duchy of Warsaw, he instructed Molière to reimburse their debt, as Napoleon had paid 3 months of the army's wages from Poland's meagre financial resources. Additionally, 13 to 15 million francs pay was to be set aside in banks in Mainz to avoid future pay arrears in the east. The figure was deliberate. Napoleon calculated that the combined pay for the Army of the Reserve and La Grande Armée was about 90 million francs every 6 months, or about 15 million a month. Mainz could provide enough pay for 1 month of campaigning, enough to score a knockout blow if past performances were anything to go by. It took until mid-1808 to really work through the issue of 1807's pay arrears, so immense was the task. Despite this success, campaign after campaign, the problem of pay arrears would rear its ugly head. Administrating an army as large and dispersed as France's was gargantuan. Cash was useful in the short term, but longer term the health of the French economy was what really mattered. Here, there was some cause for concern. Napoleon's continental system was in full swing, but imbalanced. Remember, if you will, that the system had 2 parts. One was the continental blockade on British trade, and the other part French domination of European markets. The blockade was faring poorly. Though it theoretically encompassed almost the entire European Atlantic, Mediterranean and Baltic coastlines, in truth the blockade was extremely porous. Smuggling was rife in Holland, Italy and Spain, and British merchants still ran a brisk trade in neutral Portugal, Russia and Sweden. Naturally, the British government encouraged this, leveraging their naval supremacy to crack open markets like oysters. The failure to maintain the blockade stemmed from a lack of strong French customs protection outside of France itself, and also the prevailing disinterest of participant states in enforcing the blockade. None of the states involved in the blockade were willing participants, and so where possible turned a blind eye. The result was a constant uphill fight for inspectors and customs officers. Investments in France's customs system helped a bit, but the real problem areas were further afield. So Napoleon turned to installing garrisons in problem ports, their commanders with strict orders to enforce custom laws. Napoleon could have his blockade, but only at great expense and even greater trouble. Despite the spotty blockade, it did seriously curtail maritime trade into and out of Europe. For the participant nations, France included, this had major economic repercussions. Atlantic and Mediterranean ports atrophied from lack of trade, leading to a reorientation of trade to internal routes. Since France was at the centre of this vast network, exports flowed west into France and then back east into the Grand Empire. Cities like Mulhouse, Strasbourg, Lyon and Turin had long been on the roads that serviced this east-west, west-east trade, but their critical position as the new nodes of France's economy brought with it renewed prosperity. Along France's mighty rivers, the Seine, the Oise, the Marne, the Meuse, the Rhône, the Loire, the Gironde, the Garonne, and especially the Rhine, trade flourished. Free trade and demercantilization within French borders further aided the rapid growth of inland trade routes. French industrialists were encouraged to found manufactories that produced finished goods, which could then be sold to a captive European market. Despite the growing industrial economy and stabilization of European trade, France was still an agrarian economy at its core. 75% of France's gross national product was derived from good old-fashioned farming. Despite its immense importance to the state, agriculture is one major area Napoleon never succeeded in making serious changes to. He'd been of a mind for several years to formulate some sort of code rural, or rural code. Time constraints and other priorities meant he never got around to it. So throughout the empire, the French rural economy chugged on mostly without systemic state intervention. Local authorities had the ball as the rural economy remained very localized, servicing regional towns and cities. Only the regions closest to Paris, known as les pays de grande culture, operated under more formalized structures in which the yearly surpluses were stored for state use. When the state tried to implement changes outside of les pays, they found few takers. Beyond the core departments, outdated three-field crop rotation was still common, as was the cultivation of traditional crops like wheat, rye and barley. Some innovations were introduced though. Maize and corn were cultivated with rigour, as was the humble pomme de terre, the potato. Populations of livestock and workhorses grew steadily year on year. The sheer immensity of the French agricultural sector was its chief attribute. Though overall inefficient, multiple regions produced surpluses that could deaden the impact of shortages elsewhere. Not that it really mattered all too much. Harvests throughout Napoleon's reign were generally good, with only one serious disturbance from 1811 to 1813. Surpluses led to stability in the price of basic foodstuffs, which increased at the rate of inflation but no higher. Peasant families were not, therefore, overburdened by the additional cost of food, as they had been over the previous 30 years. Even when there were shortages, the government was quick to enforce price controls. Internal affairs since Napoleon's departure had seen some notable developments. Minister of the Interior Marat oversaw the implementation of several of Napoleon's legal reforms from previous years. Added to the list was the Code de Commerce in August 1807. I won't bore you with all 34 articles of the code in all its glory. Far more interesting are the happenings in the shadowy world of espionage. Napoleon kept his Minister of Police, Joseph Fouché, on a tight leash. He retained the Paris Prefect of Police, Louis-Nicolas Dubois, to spy on the spy master. He revealed that Fouché was diligent, crafty beyond belief, and fond of house parties in which he strategically dropped revelations that he knew would be leaked in a way that furthered one of his many murky ends. Of Dubois' dealings, Fouché was fully aware and quietly approved, the strategy being very much in his own wheelhouse. Through a network of spies embedded in sensitive positions, he was the eminence grise of the French Empire. Little could happen without Fouché, and by extension Napoleon, finding out. A favourite topic for the emperor was sensationalist tabloid journalism. He constantly pressed Fouché to scrutinise journalists and pundits he believed were spreading falsehoods. Quote, "What is the Journal de Corée?" began a letter written in August 1807. Who writes it? There are many complaints about issue 113. Many of these tabloids found their way into Napoleon's gaze as extracts delivered by Marat or Champagny, who both reported more generally on public opinion in France. In March 1807, when denouncing the Journal des Débats, Napoleon explained why he was so averse to sensationalism to his Minister of Police. Quote, "Our newspapers are truly foolish, and this foolishness has a drawback, because it lends moral importance to princes who are nothing." Those unfortunates who invoked Napoleon's ire were investigated by Fouché, but rarely came to physical harm. At worst, they'd be jailed, but most were interrogated by police and their property seized. Recantations were satisfactory after Fouché applied just enough pressure to, quote, "cure these fools and inspire them to behave properly." Counterintelligence was a different beast entirely, demanding a hard line. Enemy espionage and spying had peaked in 1807, especially as the British lost their last serious continental ally in Russia. A big, porous nation like France meant enemy spies and agents could easily get in. Some were agents of continental states, even allies like Austria and Russia, though it was understood that some level of foreign surveillance was normal. Of real concern were agents of various émigré, legitimist, Choeur, and Catholic movements, supported by the British, all of whom had taken cracks at offing Napoleon. Agents were deposited by the Royal Navy on the continent. After completing their missions, they could then slink back to the coast and be extracted. Napoleon was paranoid about this kind of infiltration. In September 1807, Fouché followed instructions to detain at Fenestrella all, quote, Corsican emigrants, Piemontese, or other pensioners of England, who may be in the kingdoms of Italy, Naples, the Papal States, or Etruria. The French coast, though, was the real weak point. Coast guards of the Armée de l'Intérieur could only do so much. Napoleon's solution was to expand the gendarmerie. Marshal Jeanneau-Moncey was permitted to recruit up to an establishment number of 16,500 gendarmes, organised into 30 légions. Their purview was expanded too. By the end of 1807, they'd subsumed the functions of all departmental police outside of major cities. They patrolled roads, guarded convoys, enforced customs controls, and assisted Fouché in intercepting or arresting enemy agents. Within a few months, the gendarmerie helped bust a British spy ring led by an émigré known only as Le Chevalier. Some conspirators were arrested in Caen and Argentan by Moncey's gendarme. He reported to Napoleon, quote, I have the honour to report to your majesty that, in accordance with your orders, and after having agreed with the Minister of General Police, I brought to Paris the names of Fialet and Le Chevalier. Under interrogation, Fialet spilled the beans, revealing that he and others had been contracted to defraud public funds in Calvados to assist Le Chevalier in fomenting a revolt. In his own interrogation, the mastermind himself was revealed to be Armand Victor, a Calvados landowner, formerly a highwayman and chouan. Victor and Fialet were just the tip of the iceberg, as it became clear that this was an organised conspiracy within France, led by the shadowy Bureau de Plassans. British involvement was beyond doubt, as Royal Navy frigates had relayed messages to and from the Bureau, as well as passports to give on to their agents. The preempting of rising internal threats extended to the political sphere. Champagny reported all was well. The Sénat conservateur preserved the political system and all Napoleon's decrees. The Tribunal challenged from below, offering the only official avenue for critique. Everything was working as intended, as Napoleon had envisioned with the Constitution of Year 10. But here in August 1807, his mood calcified against even this merest hint of dissent. The Tribunal could not block legislation, but they could delay it, and in Napoleon's absence they had used this power. His response? To issue a decree by Senatus Consultum abolishing the Tribunate on August 17th. For good measure, he also raised the minimum age for senators from 35 to 40, and increased the minimum required incomes for qualifications to the departmental electoral colleges. Going nuclear like this was a severe overreaction that, in time, would have the opposite effect to that intended. Critics of the empire had no official channel remaining, but they could, and would, rally underground. Popular support for Napoleon remained high, however, despite the sheen having worn off. As the soldiers of La Grande Armée returned from Poland, they were received in festivals deliberately modelled on a Roman triumph of old. An arch was erected along the Champs-Élysées, through which the corps passed in review. Showered in flowers, draped in laurels, and acclaimed by the boom of cannon, the troops were applauded by a Paris that had turned out in droves. It was a fine honour for an army that had suffered gravely. The Polish campaign saw three major battles: Eylau, Heilsberg, and Friedland, which had cost La Grande Armée some 40,000 troops all up. Adding in the thousands of other losses from disease, desertion, and other actions, the total was higher than 60,000. At Napoleon's order, replenishments were drawn directly from the army reserve, which in turn had to be replenished. Thus the class for 1808 was called a year early. Minister of War Guillaume Clerc followed these orders to the letter, but reported some concerning trends. Conscription, by now, had long since replaced recruitment as the main source of manpower. The strain felt, especially in rural communities, triggered widespread resistance. Refractoire, deserters and defaulters who evaded conscription, numbered in their thousands. Most of this resistance was concentrated in problem departments in the Vendée, in Piedmont, and the French Pyrenees. There was yet more trouble, as explained by Minister of War Administration Pierre Deroux. Immense strain was placed on France's training and procurement system. Bringing the reserve army up to scratch and then piling the training and equipping of a class brought up early was impossible without an attendant drop in quality. Napoleon was understanding but adamant. He didn't yet know where the troops would be needed, only that they would be needed, and soon. Of all the projects implemented in 1807, none were as consequential as Napoleon's establishment of a new social order. His prior policies of ralliement, rapprochement with the Catholic Church, as well as the extension of legal equality, had successfully stitched French society back together. However, it was a job left unfinished in Napoleon's mind. His Grand Empire enjoyed solid political, military, and now economic pillars, but lacked for the strong social underpinnings he felt were necessary for his vision of France. Already Napoleon had the rudiments of the Imperial élite, his inner circle family, senior ministers, senior officers, and the Légion d'honneur. This established a principle that though all French citizens were equal legally, social status was not something that accrued equally. From this principle, Napoleon embarked upon an ambitious project to codify a top-to-bottom re-hierarchization of French society. It was not, however, to be a return to the stifling days of bloat and snobbery of the Ancien Régime. Napoleon's élite he imagined as just that, a distinguished, select group of those citizens who could be rightfully elevated for their loyalty and competent service. There were two paths for citizens to be elevated, either automatic admission earned at the upper rungs of the civil service, or personal endowment by Napoleon in recognition of outstanding civil or military service. The first tranche of admissions into the ranks of the Notables, a short list for admission into the élite, started with a list of names added to since 1800. Notables came from 5 places: lists drawn up by the departmental authorities of their own eligible citizens, members of the Légion d'honneur, all senior roles in the military or administration, the entire population of the Senate and Tribunate, and finally, anybody who Napoleon personally chose to elevate, be they members of his staff, lucky clerks or soldiers he singled out, foreign allies, even family members of his senior commanders. As part of the re-hierarchization process, the Notables was stratified into distinct ranks. At the lowest rank were the bulk of the Notables. They included all senior officials of the imperial ministries in Paris, senior departmental administrators like mayors, prefects and councillors, the electors of the electoral colleges, and senior judges, police, educators and treasurers. At its height, this rank of the Notables numbered around 100,000. Since their Notable status was attached to their offices, they enjoyed social distinction above their peers for as long as they held that office. Material benefits only became possible, and social standing lifelong, at the rank up. Admission into the 38,000-strong cohort of the Légion d'honneur brought with it an annual stipend and a lifetime social elevation. Demographically, the Légion d'honneur was dominated by military members, accounting for 90% of its membership. By contrast, the overwhelming majority of the entry-level Notables were civilians. Ascension to the Légion d'honneur was about as high as the Notables could expect to rise. It took something exceptional to become a donataire. The donataires were recipients of lands or rents authorised on a personal order from Napoleon or a senior minister. Usually, a parcel of land or its proceeds were granted for the lifetime of the recipient, after which it returned to the state. Recipients were Notables and Légionnaires who had performed some sort of signal service. Napoleon was highly selective, read stingy, about who received their dotation, a land grant. Starting in 1806, modest holdings or incomes taken exclusively from captured lands and properties were all he was willing to give. By 1814, though, the donataires numbered 6,000, their dotation worth around 30 million francs. Though this represented a serious expense, Napoleon felt it vitally necessary, as it bound a small but influential social stratum to the well-being of the empire. Of course, not all civil positions across France were made equal. Yes, there were 130 departments with 130 prefects, but who were the prefects of the Charente-Inférieure, of the Basses-Pyrénées, compared to the prefect of the Île-de-France? Thus a new rank of Notable Officier was created for those in these sorts of prestigious or sensitive positions. This also included those in culturally significant spheres, like the bishops of the Gallic Church, as well as artists and writers. At this rank too were all ministers and councillors of state. From 1804 to 1806, the notables were the one and only stratum of Napoleon's envisioned imperial élite. The next step would be to establish the next rung, an official imperial nobility with a system of peerages and titles. It was a delicate task that came down to the question of land. Around a quarter of land in France was owned by the state as les biens nationaux, the national lands. By the arrêté of July 1800 and the decree of April 1802, these lands were inviolable. Remaining real estate was in the hands of private owners who had bought it up during the Revolution, when crown lands, church lands, and noble holdings were all nationalised. These private owners were generally supportive of Napoleon, so stripping their lands would be counterproductive. Complicating the matter was also the return of the émigrés after 1802, who were devoted to the task of rebuilding their family's former possessions, one lawsuit, one crumbling manor at a time. At the outset of his reign, Napoleon could neither legally parcel out public land within France, nor risk undermining social cohesion by disenfranchising émigrés or private owners. On the face of it then, his decision to delay until 1807 seems to be due to the fact that he'd conquered vast lands in Germany, Poland, and the Western Balkans, as well as consolidated control of Holland, Italy, and Switzerland, meaning there was plenty of land to play around with. But Napoleon's solution went deeper than that. Granting lands within France would tie nobles to France, to its economy, to its social order, and since most of this land would be rural, to its agriculture. By granting conquered land in the domaine extraordinaire, Napoleon was instead giving territory that tied the nobility indissolubly to him personally. This was land conquered by him and granted by him to those who pleased him. It created a base of support outside of French influence, as well as one that had a vested interest in the preservation of the Grand Empire over the more circumspect interest in just France's national extent. Napoleon's first endowments began in March 1806, with the creation of 22 Grand Duchies, or Duchés Grand Fifs de l'Empire. 12 were made in Venetia and Aquileia, 6 in Naples, and the rest in and around northern Italy. In July 1807, the Duchy of Warsaw was similarly parcelled out. Despite having created a bunch of duchies, Napoleon doled out only a handful of his ducal titles. This has been explained as Napoleon not having enough land to endow all the worthy recipients, a claim that rings hollow. It seems more likely he was setting the table for a buffet, whetting the appetites of aspirant dukes in the Marshalate. Only with the official inauguration of the nobility, by decree in March 1808, did Napoleon invest his marshals and general staff with their ducal titles. We'll begin our survey in Italy, where the bulk of the new duchies were founded. Though not a marshal, Anne-Marie Savary was one of Napoleon's most steadfast officers, and was rewarded with the Duchy of Rovigo, not far from Ferrara. Senior Marshal Jeannot Mancy was made Duke of Conegliano, and Claude Victor Duke of Belluno, both duchies nestled in the valleys of the Eastern Alps. Closer to the coast, Claude de Roque was granted the Duchy of Friuli, a sure sign of Napoleon's favour. Nearby, Edouard Meurtrier was made Duke of Treviso. Jean Toussaint Arégy was made Duke of Padua. Moving now from north to south, we have the first endowments in the Kingdom of Naples. Nicolas Oudinot was granted the Duchy of Reggio, as much a reward for his service and just as much a place for him to convalesce from his many wounds earned in combat. Jacques MacDonald was invested with the Duchy of Taranto, a peculiar choice since MacDonald was not yet a marshal and had not yet served directly with Napoleon. Nonetheless, he was a capable commander and had done well in Holland and Italy. Crossing the Adriatic Sea, we have the two Balkan duchies. Jean-Baptiste Bessayer was made Duke of Istria, one of the larger endowments. Jean Soult received the Duchy of Dalmatia, despite having never set foot in the region. Most of these endowments came in 1808, though a few more were forthcoming with the invasions of Iberia. Andoche Junot was made the Duc d'Abrante, carved out of a conquered Portugal. And in 1809, Corps Commander Louis-Gabriel Suchet received the Duchy of Albufera in Valencia. The other type of ducal title reserved for the marshalate were victory titles, Victory titles commemorated a battle in which the named duke had distinguished themselves, usually under independent command. Jean was made Duke of Montebello for his signal service during the Battle of Montebello way back in June 1800. Pierre Augereau was made Duke of Castiglione, commemorating his actions there from August 1796. In Augereau's case, Napoleon was spoilt for choice for which battle to commemorate, but settled on this one, the earliest of his many victories. André Massena was granted the Duchy of Rivoli, partly recognition for his role in the Battle of Rivoli in January 1797, and part promise that he would, one day, be able to return to his adopted homeland. Auguste Marmont, commander of the corps operating in the Balkans, and chief artillerist of La Grande Armée, was made Duke of Ragusa for his subjugation of that city and the region of Dalmatia. Napoleon forged 3 victory titles in Germany. For his superb victory at Auerstedt, Louis-Nicolas de Vaux was made Duke of Auerstedt. Likewise, Michel Ney, commanding his corps expertly in the Ulm campaign of 1805, was made Duke of Elchingen. Louis Lefebvre, the humble hero of Danzig, who had reduced that mighty fortress in tough winter conditions, was made the Duke of Danzig. And, as a bit of a throwback, François Kellermann, who in the emergency days of 1792 had helped to hold back the Austro-Prussian army, was made Duke of Valmy. Compared to a regular duchy, it might seem a real downgrade to receive a victory title. But Napoleon made sure material compensation was proffered, mostly in the form of dotation in Poland. 20 million francs worth of land, amounting to a fifth of the Duchy of Warsaw's state-controlled territory, provided their incomes to 27 marshals and senior generals. Ceded were valuable principalities like Sivert, which provided Jean 100,000 francs annually, and Lovisch, providing de Vaux with twice as much. In 1809, another 10 million francs worth of land was parcelled out of conquered Galicia to another 27 senior commanders, political allies, friends and family. Of course, Napoleon's marshals and senior commanders were only some of the beneficiaries of ducal endowment. Government ministers, senior politicians and key allies, who were the cogs in the French bureaucratic and political apparatus, were also rewarded with their own duchies. Some of these names will be familiar, which makes this a good opportunity to catch up where a few of our characters have been in the last few years. We'll start with Melzi d'Eril, Chancellor of the Kingdom of Italy. Melzi had been an early backer of Napoleon's rule in Italy. Second thoughts had since crept in, but it was not enough for him to turn down the Duchy of Lodi, a rich Lombard region. Charles-François Lebrun, at one time technically co-equal to Napoleon as one of the triumvirate consuls, had largely withdrawn from public life since then. He cited his age, though a growing apprehension to Napoleon's authoritarianism is the more convincing answer. When called upon, he served as the Governor-General in Liguria from 1804 to 1806, accepting the prosperous Duchy of Piacenza as recompense. Prestigious and rich was the Duchy of Parma, which could therefore only be bestowed on a key ally. Chosen was Jean-Jacques Cambacérès, former consul, now Arch-Chancellor of the Empire. Hugues Bernard Maret, diplomat, politician and key framer of Napoleon's many reforms and constitutions, had more recently served as Minister of State since 1804. Maret was rightly regarded as the most reliable man in Napoleon's élite. Smart, diligent, hard-working, he was rewarded with the Duchy of Bassano in 1809. Minister of War Guillaume Clark, having replaced Berthier in 1806, was on the top of the list for endowments owing to his stellar service. The endowment also served as something of a hedge against his corruption. The Duchy of Feltre was at once just desserts and a source of income separate to the War Ministry's ledgers. Minister of the Interior Jean-Baptiste Champagny, an astute and reserved politician, had served in that post since 1804. He was made Duke of Cadore, an area near Friuli. Heading south, we have Claude Ambroise Régnier, the Minister of Justice. Régnier coolly oversaw France's courts, even surviving the transition to empire, having served since 1802. It was Régnier who was in charge of implementing the Code Napoleon and other judicial reforms. In recognition, he was made Duke of Massa, a hilly region in the East Ligurian Alps. The superb Minister of Finance, Charles Gaudin, received the coastal Duchy of Gaeta, not far from the city of Naples. And last up is Joseph Fouché, made Duke of Otranto, for his service as Minister of Police and a kind of back-pocket Minister of the Interior. For all those notables who, for one reason or another, fell short of endowment with their grand fief de l'Empire, there was always the chance of being made a count, baron, or chevalier of the empire. For our purposes, we aren't too interested in the barons and chevaliers. Either their office automatically granted them the title, or Napoleon did. The counts, on the other hand, are pertinent, as they include several key figures we've met already. Where the dukes were roughly split between military and civil nominees, the imperial counts were dominated by civil servants. Mayors, prefects, councillors, and judges predominated. Certain officers, like archbishop and mayor of a major city, were conferred count status at the request of the office holder. What's more, this is where senior ministers and officials who fell short of a duchy ended up. We'll cover a few of them. Félix Julien Jean Bigot, Minister of Ecclesiastical Affairs and contributor to the Code Napoleon, was made the Count of Préaumoneux. François Barbé-Marbois, former Minister of the Treasury, and from 1807 President of the Court of Accounts, was made a Count in 1813. Jean-Antoine Chaptal, former Minister of the Interior, was made Count of Chanteloup. Emmanuel Crétet, Governor of the Bank of France in 1806, and soon to be the Minister of the Interior, earned the County of Chaumol. Denis Descrès, Minister of the Navy, was made a Count in 1813. Jean-François Aimé, the Minister of War Administration, got the County of Dijon. Aimé's replacement from 1809 onwards, Jean Girard Losset, received the County of Cessac. Nicolas François, Minister of the Treasury, was made Count of Molion. And finally, we have Jean-Pierre Bachasson, Count of Montalivet, a senior minister who would later serve as Minister of the Interior. Whether prince, count, baron, or chevalier, all received a dotation scaling with their rank, but just like with the ducal titles, they automatically lapsed upon the death of the title holder. The underpinning principle behind any of Napoleon's endowments was a concession, that the titles were merely leased by the state, and true ownership remained with them. In 9 articles he cleared with Combeferre, it was decided that a title could not be sold, not be revoked, not be divided, without Napoleon's express permission. Reinforcing this principle were rules surrounding inheritance. Though all noble titles were hereditary by default, the office that earned them that right was separate from the title. By order of primogeniture, their biological and adopted sons could inherit the title, but never the office. As per Article 8, quote, "The transmission of said hereditary titles shall not confer any right to the positions or functions held by the ancestor, as appointment to said positions and functions may only ever be the result from the election of the people, or from our choice, in accordance with our constitutions." The only exceptions were the count and ducal titles, which could be converted into majorat, heritable by primogeniture after 6 years of good service. Though this was technically a legal mechanism, in effect the right was still Napoleon's to confer, and another check on the potential power of the nobility. Certainly being a noble in Napoleonic France was not the same as it was in any contemporary European state. The longevity of the nobility in Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia lay in the fact that they were an established aristocracy, with land and wealth separate from the state, and the exclusive rights and privileges needed to maintain that independence. Napoleon's nobility were bestowed their lands and titles contingent on good service. Even in the case where the majorat was invoked, the total right to revoke any title lay with the emperor. There is some nuance to this. The nobility in Britain were largely checked by Parliament. Russian nobles enjoyed near total autonomy. Certainly though, in the case of Napoleonic France, the new nobility had earned their place to some extent, setting it apart from a regular aristocracy. Napoleon's elevations varied in their origins. 59% were from the military, 22% civil servants, and the rest notables. Any citizen could become a noble. Napoleon's caveat was that they had to deserve it. That all being said, this was still a nobility. Exclusiveness and prestigiousness were the point. Part of the process of ennoblement meant proving one had sufficient income to maintain a noble lifestyle. Dukes had to earn 200,000 francs a year, counts 30,000, barons 15,000, and chevalier 3,000. Where one of Napoleon's favourites fell short, the difference was made up with dotation. Otherwise, if the candidate fell short, they fell short. In this way, the ranks of the nobility were not swollen, Napoleon ennobled 3,263 citizens, starting with 744 in 1808 and generally decreasing year on year, with only 1810's 1,085 an exception. The highest an ambitious French citizen might reasonably hope to rise within the nobility was duke. A very, very select few, however, could make it into the ranks of the princes. This exclusive preserve was the vehicle for Napoleon's dynastic ambitions. He envisioned the Grand Empire surrounded by client states, ruled by Bonaparte and imperial princes. There were 3 orders of the imperial princes. The third order were inner circle members of Napoleon's household. Princes of the second and first order were his family members, the second order being those related by marriage, the first order those related by blood. We'll begin with the princes of the third order. There were only 2, Charles-Maurice Talleyrand and Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte. Their reasons for being made princes varied. Talleyrand, Minister of Foreign Affairs, long-term advisor and ally to Napoleon, was not a dynastic match. Not only was he too old and infirm, but their working relationship had deteriorated severely in recent years. However, Talleyrand was still an early supporter and a grand dignitaire who deserved more than just a duchy. In 1806 he had been bestowed the title of Prince of Benevento, a region in Naples. Additionally, Talleyrand received dotations and gifts within France that secured his princely status. At 44, Bernadotte might still technically have been young enough for a dynastic match, but was already married to one of Napoleon's early flames, Désirée Clary. At various points, Bernadotte could have married into the Bonapartes if he divorced Désirée. All the Bonaparte sisters were taken by 1806, but that didn't preclude something in the future. Making Bernadotte Prince of Pontecorvo not only tickled his fancy, but it made him eligible for an imperial match should the possibility arise. We arrive now at the princes of the second order. In the main, these were members of Napoleon's family not related by blood. There was a caveat. Dukes and duchesses were princes of the second order, whereas kings and queens were princes of the first order. This was significant in the case of Elisa Bonaparte, who married Félix Bacchiocchi in 1797. You may recall that this marriage was one of love, not advantage. Napoleon opposed the match but could do nothing about it, even as emperor. He did, however, show off his snobbish side by refusing to admit Elisa or Félix to the First Order. Women, even Napoleon's sisters, were automatically meant to be in the Second Order, and only rose to the First Order if they became a queen. Since Félix was not a noble, certainly not a king, there was no path for elevation for Elisa, and so her title as the Duchess of Lucca Piombino was her sole title. Félix was recognised as duke, but not a reigning duke, though he became a prince of the Second Order by dint of marriage to Elisa. Pauline had long since returned from Saint-Domingue and remarried in 1803 to Camillo Borghese, an Italian nobleman. Borghese was the Duke of Guastalla, making Pauline Duchess of Guastalla. This was a problem, as Camillo's title both predated Napoleon's investitures and was a constituent part of the Duchy of Parma. Though Parma had since been reclassed as a Duchy of the Kingdom of Italy, the distinction still mattered to Borghese and other Italians. The compromise was to recognise Camillo as Prince and Pauline Princess of the Second Order. By any reasonable estimation, Eugène Beauharnais should have been a Prince of the First Order. He was the Viceroy of Italy, beloved by Napoleon, and heir presumptive to the throne. There was a problem, however. Eugène was not Napoleon's blood, but instead his adopted son by marriage to Joséphine. It didn't hamper their personal relationship, but certainly prevented Eugène from being considered in the absolute top rung of the elite. In the cruel game of dynastic ambition, to confer Eugène a First Order status might complicate a succession if a biological heir was secured, and even in the event one wasn't, he was still a prince and could be elevated later on. In the meantime, Eugène remained a rung below. There was another odd out-of-place prince of the Second Order, Louis-Alexandre Berthier. Napoleon had made Berthier Prince of Neuchâtel. Technically, this should have made him a Prince of the Third Order, but Napoleon simply decreed an upgrade, and that was that. For Napoleon's indispensable right-hand man, it was a mark of great distinction. This was as high as a non-family member could rise under the empire. As part of his endowment, Berthier also received the Palais de Chambord and its extensive estates. Decades abandoned, the palace was in dire need of restoration. Still, it's impossible not to see a mirror image in Berthier and one of the palace's previous owners, Maurice de Saxe. Maurice had been made a Marshal of the Empire and gifted Chambord by Louis XV after the Battle of Fontenoy in 1745. Berthier had no one great battle to his name, but shared in the glory of every one of Napoleon's. Now comes the ranks of the princes of the First Order. We start with Napoleon's brothers. In something of a revival of the Bourbon conception of princes of the blood, Joseph, Jérôme, Louis, and Lucien were princes of the First Order. As part of grander dynastic ambitions, each was to be bestowed a major title. Louis was made King of Holland in 1806, making his wife, Hortense Beauharnais, sister of Empress Josephine, Queen of Holland. Jérôme was given the Kingdom of Westphalia as it was formed out of territory ceded to the Confederation of the Rhine by defeated Prussia. In August 1806, King Frederick von Württemberg agreed to marry his daughter, Katharina, to Jérôme. This immediately made her a princess of the First Order. In July 1808, Joseph was conferred the Kingdom of Naples, ceasing to be the Grand Duke of Cleves-Berg. His wife, Julie Clary, received status as Princess of the First Order. Lucien lived in self-imposed exile in Rome, a kind of king in reserve as far as Napoleon was concerned. Was he a prince of the First Order? And technically, even if he had no lands or titles. Oddly, Lucien's place was clearer than that of Joachim Murat, at least initially. Even as Grand Duke of Cleves-Berg, replacing Joseph, Murat was only a prince of the Second Order by way of marriage to Caroline Bonaparte. In this rung he remained until getting the hand-me-down Kingdom of Naples in 1808, whereupon the regal title made him a prince of the First Order. To top the hierarchy off, as you'd expect, was Napoleon, his official titles being Emperor of the French, King of Italy, Mediator of the Swiss cantons, and Protector of the Confederation of the Rhine. Worth mentioning too are the Grands Dignitaires of the Empire, a collection of 10 ceremonial posts Napoleon assigned to princes of particular import. The Grand Elector was Joseph, the Vice Grand Elector, Talleyrand. Louis was made High Constable, Berthier Vice Constable, Arch-Chancellor was Cambacérès, Arch-Chancellor of State, Eugène, Lebrun was Arch-Treasurer, and Murat, weirdly, was Grand Admiral. Finally, Camillo Borghese was Governor-General of the Domaine Extraordinaire. Between all of this work, all of these functions and programs, Napoleon was a very busy boy. Much of his time was spent in the Palais des Tuileries, the Tuileries Palace. The site was an ideal centre of power. The Senate convened in the Palais de Luxembourg, only a modest coach trip south across the Pont des Tuileries and into the 6e arrondissement. West of the Tuileries Palace was the Palais Bourbon, home of the Corps Législatif. A hop and a skip from the Palais Bourbon was the Quai d'Orsay, headquarters of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the only ministry not to operate out of the Tuileries complex. Like tents around a campfire, most of the foreign embassies cropped up near the Quai d'Orsay, or else on the picturesque boulevards surrounding the Place de la Concorde. Paris municipal government operated to the east of the Tuileries out of the Hôtel de Ville. Within spitting distance was the Ile de la Cité, where the Palais de Justice, France's legal nerve centre, and the Cathedral of Notre-Dame were both to be found. Both of Napoleon's main residences in Saint-Cloud and Malmaison were west of central Paris in the Bois de Boulogne. Under the reins of César, the horses could get Napoleon to and from within an hour. When installed in the Tuileries, Napoleon himself occupied little more than his office, cabinet, with its adjoining bedroom, a meeting room for the Conseil d'État, and when eating, a dining room. All were modestly furnished. Napoleon's schedule from on campaign, where he would work late into the night and slept where he could, was maintained. Without doubt, to use the modern term, he was a workaholic, spending every waking moment working or readying for work. Conseil meetings, as we've already seen, were uniquely open. We're past the most dynamic phase of the major Napoleonic reforms, so mostly these meetings were updates and analysis, and Napoleon relished this kind of constructive criticism from loyal opposition. Conseil advice was valued, even if it wasn't always followed. Mostly, he remained content to sit and listen, internalizing the information delivered. When Napoleon did weigh in, he didn't do so as an emperor, but as a senior civil servant. Work in the cabinet saw Napoleon rely heavily on his team of secretaries, led in 1807 by Agathon Fin. Fin's 20-strong team read aloud, transcribed, translated, or edited anything the emperor requested. Letters, reports, articles, charters, you name it. Documents would be prioritized in discrete piles, the most important on the large desk or surrounding chairs when it overflowed, the less important documents piled on the floor. Anything irrelevant was burned. Indeed, most work took place on the floor. Secretaries were gymnasts cum scribes as they bent down to write something out or huddle around a document. All the while Napoleon sat on a small sofa by the fire, oftentimes wearing only a nightgown. His old habit of ceaseless pacing was rarer now, but his mind had not slowed a bit. Napoleon could go from dictating a novel curriculum to critiquing a news article to adjusting the household budget, and then back to the curriculum, all in a moment. This incredible ability to recall and retain information effortlessly was universally remarked upon. Corrections were frequent but rarely transformative, usually more clarifications than anything. About the only thing Napoleon would write himself were letters to Josephine, or to one of his many mistresses. Work regularly carried on long into the night. Occasionally Napoleon would step out for a quick, energizing nap, never more than an hour or two. The experience must have been surreal. Fin recalled that, without a word, Napoleon would stop mid-train of thought and rest, either on the cot in the bedroom or on the chaise longue in the cabinet. He'd be out like a lamp, sleep calmly, and then suddenly be awake, ready to resume the thought as though he'd never stopped. Napoleon still managed to sleep the now recommended 8 or so hours a day, but always in these short, disconnected naps. His secretaries didn't have the same long-life batteries and had to rest in shifts to keep up. When exhaustion set in, Napoleon relented, allowing his secretaries to rest by the cabinet's fireplace or even sleep on the chaise longue. When the mood took him, he might take one or two incognito on a night walk through the city to buy them a coffee or hot chocolate. Memoirs from former household staff to Napoleon are replete with examples of these sorts of little indulgences. He was a demanding master, but an empathetic employer. The longevity of his staff speaks to his good treatment. César, his alcoholic coachman and veteran of the Wars of the Coalition, served the household the entirety of Napoleon's career. Talk of replacement by a younger, stouter man was quashed. César might have been a drunk, but he was the drunk who saved Napoleon's life on the Rue Saint-Nicaise, who had braved enemy fire at Marengo and was never once late for departure. His hand was steady when it needed to be. Small mistakes from servants, a spilt drink, a tepid bath, and unlit fire, Napoleon overlooked. He also paid well despite being notoriously stingy. Even old Louis Bourrienne, who was sacked in 1802 for defrauding the household, was let down gently. Napoleon secured for him the mayorship of Hamburg. How's that for a golden parachute? Empathetic though he could be, Napoleon remained as exacting as ever. Nothing escaped his attention. In the aftermath of the Battle of Eylau, he had instructed Fouché to report the Madame d'Esdaile to Switzerland on the grounds she'd masterminded a group of disaffected émigré socialites. In a letter written about a month later, Napoleon finished by saying, quote, "I shall not tell you the plans this ridiculous clique had in every event of my death, as the Minister of Police ought to know all about." Fouché had Staël well in check, but that hardly slaked Napoleon's appetite for updates over what was a trivial matter. In the same month, the dockyards at Toulon were instructed to preserve the warship Miron, after Decrès confirmed it was to be broken up. This was the frigate which had whisked Napoleon and his staff out of Egypt in 1799, and had been named after one of Napoleon's fallen aides-de-camp. So fond was Napoleon of this little ship that he had a model built and displayed at Malmaison. On the more serious side, when word reached Napoleon that one of Eugène Beauharnais' aides-de-camp had misplaced important dispatches, he instructed his son-in-law on how this dereliction should be punished. Any minister, general, bureaucrat or clerk no matter how senior, no matter how junior, could find a sealed letter with the gleaming Napoleonic N sitting on their desk, their day soon to be derailed with queries and demands thought to be well beyond the attention of an emperor. Throughout it all, Napoleon maintained his extensive correspondence, some with long-standing pen pals like his brother kings, on whom he heaped admonishments mixed with instructions on how to rule. Then there were new connections made in the wake of Tilsit, the Russian ambassador to Paris, Count Pyotr Tolstoy, the Austrian foreign minister, Clemens von Metternich, and most esteemed of all, the Russian emperor, Alexander I. Of course, even for Napoleon, it could not be all work, no rest. From July to November 1807, he divided his time between the Tuileries and Josephine's estate, Malmaison. Malmaison had by now been long occupied and modified by Josephine, who aimed to turn it from a fairly modest estate into a palace of wonder and entertainment. A famous rose garden was planted, overlooked by several pavilions and fountains. Installed were an aviary and a vineyard. Josephine even stocked an orangery with never-before-seen flora from various French expeditions. Exotic African, Asian, and Australian animals were left to roam the grounds freely. An orangutan sat in at lunches. A cockatoo was taught to simply say Bonaparte. Josephine was very proud of her menagerie, though her many guests regarded it as tacky. Indeed, Josephine struggled, even as empress, to ever find friendship among the ladies of French high society, few of whom could shed their prejudice against the Creole empress. They'd mistaken Josephine's audience. Though Malmaison was to serve as a home for the Bonaparte and the Beauharnais, the intended beneficiary was always Napoleon. Modest furnishings, functional rooms, and lush open grounds. These were his preferences. It still took a good deal of cajoling to get Napoleon to actually down tools and come to Malmaison. He might pop in for a few hours or spend several days there, usually over a weekend. A tight schedule was still maintained, and Napoleon continued to work out of Malmaison's cabinet. Time permitting, he stuck to a family dinner around 6 p.m. Ordinarily, he'd eat quickly, taking no more than 10 minutes. The point was sustenance, and though Napoleon had his preference of potato and onions, he never shirked pasta, soup, bread, whatever the kitchen had to hand. Meals were shared with his staff, so the kitchen kept a chicken on the spit to plate up at a moment's notice. Even more formal, proper meals with generals, politicians, dignitaries, family members, and ministers were perfunctory. Josephine would protest Napoleon had not eaten properly, but the best she might squeeze out of him was a half hour before he'd suddenly depart with a brusque shove away from the table. Meals were also simple and cheap. Several dinner guests remarked on the poor vintages served at the emperor's table. But they drank what he drank, which was whatever was cheap but decent. When asked about his eating habits, Napoleon is reported to have quipped, quote, "If you want to dine well, dine with Cambaceres. If you want to dine poorly, dine with Daru. And if you want to dine quickly, dine with me." Indeed, Napoleon had few vices. He never drank to excess, usually diluting his wine. He started his morning with fresh water. He never drank spirits except on medical advice, and didn't like coffee or hot drinks. He didn't smoke, but did sometimes chew tobacco. Napoleon's only real vice, apart from beautiful women, was snuff, cocaine, taken as a pinch from a small black box he carried. Though this habit might seemingly explain the font of his energies, Napoleon could go months without, chiefly on campaign. Indeed, relaxation was not something Napoleon really did, nor was exercise. Long gone was the defined chin and flat face. We're well into the era of a plump, round-cheeked Napoleon that we all know from portraits and artwork. About the only thing he did do for exercise was hunt. By all accounts, he was very, very bad at it. Off campaign, he took long, hot baths, largely on medical advice from his family physician, Jean-Nicolas Corvisart. The emperor kept working half submerged and insisted upon being shaved and read the latest dispatches from foreign, usually British, newspapers. Josephine also read to him on carriage rides or in Malmaison's salon, but not books Napoleon cared to read, only newest release novels and histories, so he could stay up to date on the latest in the French literary scene. There must have been some times he genuinely loosened up, perhaps the only time he could as emperor. Napoleon loved a fireside chat with those few who could hold his attention, Children, first those of his inner circle, later his own, he spoiled with candy and garden games. Board games, chess, and cards were also a joy, though Napoleon couldn't stand losing. He was known to cheat, but never failed to have a secretary surreptitiously deliver a letter when money was on the line. Though in private or functional settings, Napoleon was personally quite modest, he remained an emperor, and the office demanded opulence. The year 1807 saw a revival of many of the trappings of public royal benevolence, with masses, galas, fêtes, and public works all celebrated. Sometimes these functions required Napoleon dress in his imperial best. He would much have preferred to be in his simple chasseur à cheval uniform, or that of an officer in the Imperial Garde Grenadiers, completed by the Medal of the King of Italy and his customary bicorn. Everywhere he travelled saw the imperial household proceed in a procession of 60 coaches escorted by armed cavalry. Fine jewellery, gilded adornments, bespoke swords, such were the trappings of empire, from which Napoleon derived little pleasure, save for a vast collection of thousands of precious stones. As emperor, he also took possession of France's dozens of imperial palaces. These included, of course, the Tuileries Palace, Malmaison, and Saint-Cloud, which were Napoleon's primary residences. But the extended list covered fully 39 imperial palaces and estates. The largest were Compiègne, Fontainebleau, Meudon, Marac, Les Trianon, Rambouillet, and Versailles. Properties outside of France included the Palazzo d'Arazzo in Genoa, the Deutschhaus in Mainz, Lecken Palace in Brussels, the Palazzo Reale in Milan, Castello Stupinici in Turin, and Montecavallo of Rome. The sixth largest item of expense on the imperial budget was the cost of restoring and then maintaining these palaces, equaling about 25 million francs per year. For a man so keen to economise on minute details of his household, down to how many cups of coffee could be served, this was an exorbitant burden on state finances. At the opposite end of the economising spectrum was Foreign Minister Talleyrand. There was a man who enjoyed the finer things in life. Much had changed since Napoleon and Talleyrand first met in 1797. For several years, Napoleon had relied upon Talleyrand as the foremost diplomatist in France, the go-to expert on European power politics. There had been disagreements and disputes, of course, but nothing terminal. Fissures only became permanent after Napoleon became emperor. Though he still happily accepted Talleyrand's advice, he was not bound by it, and Napoleon's vision of foreign policy prevailed. Talleyrand had his own vision, one that preserved parity within the balance of European powers, whereas Napoleon desired nothing less than total French dominance. Two diametrically opposed worldviews came into stark relief in 1806 during the war with Prussia. The foreign minister wanted to avoid France being seen as an aggressor, and so implored Napoleon to act in accord with France's German allies, and to respect the neutrality of Hesse-Kassel. Napoleon's response was to suborn the armies of his allies and to dismiss Talleyrand's concerns with Hesse-Kassel. Quote, "I'm not fooled by Hesse's neutrality," the emperor said. "I'm astonished that you are, after what you've seen of my movements and the retreat of the Prussian army, which has full access." This tone of brusqueness, even rudeness, was typical. By October 22nd, Napoleon went a step further, demanding the Hessians mobilise for war with Prussia and join the Confederation of the Rhine. The spat revealed another aspect of their dispute: Napoleon's short-term military concerns, clashing with Talleyrand's longer-term diplomatic endeavours. Ultimately, Napoleon would invariably direct the course of the war. Talleyrand could accept that. But during peace negotiations, not so much. Generally, Napoleon gave Talleyrand a diplomatic goal that the foreign minister was to attain. Only rarely did he let him negotiate without interference, though it did happen with the minor counties of Lippe, Gotha, and Anhalt that October. In the case of Saxony, Talleyrand learned of the terms of the peace only hours before the Saxons did, when Claude de Rock delivered its pre-written contents to the foreign minister. Talleyrand could feel himself inexplicably inched out of peacemaking duties. Surely, though, there was some room for compromise and conciliation with Prussia, a major power and a strong check against Russia and Austria. Talleyrand maintained that the military strength of the Central European powers ought to be balanced. Specifically, Talleyrand wanted Prussia largely intact after the war to resist Russian and Austrian ambitions. Napoleon, as we know, pushed the hard line, aiming to defang and dismember Prussia. On November 26, 1806, Napoleon ordered Talleyrand and a gaggle of German plenipotentiaries into Berlin. He was to oust Ambassador Lucchesini, Talleyrand's natural interlocutor for a peace settlement. At the end of the day, Talleyrand did carry out Napoleon's orders, albeit begrudgingly. The years of 1806 and 1807 were particularly intensive for Napoleon diplomatically, and they offloaded a lot of the busy work of negotiations with Denmark, Spain, Portugal, Russia, Austria and Prussia to a receptive Talleyrand. The tone of Napoleon's orders, however, was that of a leader to a subordinate, rankling the old foreign minister. Napoleon was aware of Talleyrand's growing disillusion, but gave no admonishment. He even ignored Talleyrand's blatant corruption. The foreign minister was infamous for shaking down foreign princes. The turning point in their relationship, the falling out, arrived in 1807 as the War of the Fifth Coalition was winding down. As it was clear peace was at hand, Talleyrand advocated Austrian mediation. In this way, he hoped to deflate the rising belligerence of Austria by involving them in the peace process, a clever diplomatic stratagem that would bind Vienna to any terms agreed between France and Russia. Napoleon entertained the idea, but in the end opted for his own direct approach at Tilsit. Talleyrand, now at Königsberg, was not ignored outright. Napoleon told his foreign minister that, quote, "I very much wish you to come to Tilsit promptly." Napoleon wasn't lying, he certainly sought Talleyrand's counsel, but he wouldn't have followed through on his advice since he couldn't stomach conciliation with Prussia. How might the dinner interactions with Queen Louisa have gone if the foreign minister was there endorsing the relinquishing of Magdeburg? Keeping Talleyrand at arm's length had other justifications. There were 3 simultaneous diplomatic emergencies that same month: negotiations with the Ottoman Empire, an alliance with Denmark, and the defiance of Portugal, all of which demanded a deft hand as Napoleon focused on Alexander. Regardless of Napoleon's motives, Talleyrand saw his sidelining as a snub. When Napoleon and Talleyrand met again on the Emperor's return through Königsberg, they clashed, if the rumours are to be believed, in a shouting match. Napoleon dismissed Talleyrand on August 10, 1807, though Talleyrand had resigned the day before. Officially, Napoleon cited complaints from French allies about the foreign minister's extortions. But the real reason was clear. They could no longer work together. Jean-Baptiste Champagny replaced Talleyrand as the foreign minister, while Emmanuel Crétet took over the vacant post of Minister of the Interior. Champagny's elevation was unceremonious. Quote, "Monsieur Champagny, my Minister of Foreign Affairs, the deputies from Danzig should have arrived. I wish them to draft their constitution so that it may be submitted for my approval." No easing in, straight into action. The fallout to the falling out was not horrific, as is often imagined. A jaded Talleyrand planning revenge on an emperor who despised him with a fiery passion. True hate would come later. For now, both men remained on decent terms, and Napoleon let Talleyrand down gently. He was allowed to return to Paris and retained all his dignity as Prince of Benevento. What's more, Napoleon promoted Talleyrand. Quote, "Mon cousin, by decree of this day we have charged you with fulfilling, on an interim basis and in the absence of Prince Eugène, Viceroy of Italy, the functions attributed to the dignity of Arch-Chancellor of State. As these functions have not yet been exercised, our intention is that you attend to this matter in all its details, and that you present us with a draft regulation specifying more particularly the responsibilities of the Arch-Chancellor of State, defining its relationship with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and regulating its use of the office so as not to hinder the operation of that department." It was, in effect, an invitation for Talleyrand to craft his own office and act within the confines he set. Crucially, it kept him in government, thereby allowing Napoleon to continue to pick the brain of the best diplomat in France. So in effect, Talleyrand's dismissal was not the end of a long and fruitful relationship. In many ways, it was just a new phase. Without doubt, though, Napoleon relished his free hand in foreign policy. The timing was crucial as attentions turned from Tilsit to a flashpoint in the Baltic. After the collapse of the ineffectual Ministry of All the Talents, a Tory government assumed power in Westminster. William Henry Cavendish, Duke of Portland, became Prime Minister. Robert Stewart, Viscount Castlereagh, served as Secretary of War, and George Canning as Foreign Secretary. All three differed in temperament and preference. Portland was a proponent of continental war, Castlereagh a perceptive ominous grise favouring espionage and diplomacy, Canning a bristly francophobe who cared not how France be humiliated, only that it be done. Uniting all three was a disapprobation at the Grenville administration's colonial strategy. The Portland administration wanted large-scale and sustainable offensives to be opened up against the French in Europe and its near abroad. In 1807, however, their chances of employing this continental strategy were slim to none. On the diplomatic side of things, all Britain's mainland allies were gone, save for Sweden and Portugal. Austria, Prussia and Russia were all off the board. A dismembered Prussia was currying favour in Paris, aiming to shed the burden of bearing French garrisons. Austria, though not dismissive of the idea of war with France before Tilsit, afterwards felt very vulnerable, opting instead for caution. And Russia? Well, Russia and Britain had a long list of grievances. British support for Sweden, the Anglo-Russian debacle in Holland, and failure to provide sufficient aid being just the most recent provocations. The mood was similarly sour on the home front. A strong pro-peace party of both Tories and Whigs had coalesced around Francis Burdett, Lord Cochrane. Parliament was growing receptive to calls for peace, calls heightened when combined with broad public support as the Peace Party promised a long overdue electoral reform. Over in Ireland, Catholic rumblings for emancipation proved a deep well of roiling discontent that divided public opinion and government ministers alike. Economically, the continental blockade was taking a toll. In 1807, the value of British trade in Northern Europe fell from £10 million annually to only £3 million. Without an outlet for manufactured goods, the British manufacturing sector, especially in the industrialising north of England, contracted sharply. Layoffs, wage decreases and slowdowns were common, leading to popular demonstrations against the war. King George III should have been a bulwark, as he was a vocal proponent of the government's anti-French policy. What made him a liability were his many well-documented infirmities that cast a pall over his reign. In the event of a succession, the Whiggish Duke of Wales would assume the throne, and likely be put upon to oust the Tories. Even had the home front been secure, Britain would still have been severely constrained by limited military resources. Tens of thousands of soldiers had been recruited into the Fencibles from 1800 to 1804 in expectation of Napoleon's invasion of England. Problem was, these were militia units that could not be induced to serve overseas. Most of Britain's trained manpower in its regular regiments was dispersed across their vast international empire. Even after denuding colonial garrisons in India and the Caribbean, downscaling in the Mediterranean, and cutting short their South American expeditions, the British Army still only numbered 30,000 troops ready for expeditionary operations. There were then plenty of pressures facing Portland, Canning and Castlereagh. So why then did they continue the war? Inertia certainly played a part. Britain had been fighting France since 1803 after all. Overall, their logic was that Britain was facing, for the first time, what might be called a true existential threat. The spectre of invasion might have triggered panic in the general population from 1802 to 1804, but Westminster was never truly worried, owing to the supremacy of the Royal Navy. But collapse of the manufacturing economy, the closing of European markets, weakening of the empire, revolts and deprivation at home. Those were threats an order of magnitude more dire. Making peace with Napoleon now would see France retain control of the Netherlands and the Low Countries, Britain's traditional entrepot into Europe. Likewise, Britain would have no serious continental partner able to militarily challenge France and keep them in check. It was an increasingly narrow and unpopular view, but Westminster stuck to its policy of belligerence until France was contained, the flow of trade resumed, and the European balance of power restored. Those aims were, in 1807, absolute fantasy, with Napoleon at the height of his powers. Diplomatic overtures having failed, Britain's military operations were limited entirely to support for smuggling operations and espionage. The crux of these operations was of course the Royal Navy, still mighty, still dominant, though perhaps not for long. It was the Admiralty's perennial fear that should the French rebuild their naval strength, the Royal Navy would face a peer threat once more. Certainly the French Navy, under Denis Decrès, was steadily rebuilding. That said, the timeline for a fighting-fit ship of the line was years long, and the British had a massive head start. But if the French could seize some ships, like those in Lisbon or Copenhagen, the balance might shift. It was not mere suspicion to think that Napoleon was interested in the Danish fleet. Half the reason he'd been delayed in returning to France was to put pressure on Copenhagen to make an alliance, an endeavour he'd been pursuing since the bombardment of Copenhagen in 1801. Certainly King Christian VII von Oldenburg was inclined towards France, but opted for neutrality amidst the opposing pulls of French, British, and even Russian currents. By 1807, the status quo had become impossible for all sides. British occupation of Stralsund on behalf of Sweden proved to Napoleon his enemy had the expeditionary capacity to force Danish submission. And for the British, the pre-positioning of Bernadotte's First Corps in Holstein was proof positive that the Danish fleet would be in French hands unless something was done. It also didn't hurt that by compelling Denmark to join their war with France, Danish ports might make a chink in the chain of the Continental blockade. Napoleon issued standing orders for Bernadotte to invade through Jylland into Sjælland, pending the outcome of final negotiations conducted by Talleyrand. But the British struck first. On July 30th, a squadron of the Royal Navy under James Gambier anchored unopposed off Copenhagen. Under flag of truce, a deputation led by William Carteret, commander of the embarked troops, went atop the Danish fortifications to offer British protection in return for a declaration of war on France and the opening of Danish ports to trade. It was a devil's bargain. Bernadotte's corps was preparing throughout August and would likely move at the end of the month. King Christian expected that despite being reinforced by several more ships and 18,000 troops, the British were no match for a French corps 12,000 strong, reinforced by nearly twice as many German allies. He accepted Napoleon's terms, conditioned on the protection of Copenhagen. Word soon reached the British anchored offshore. British troops disembarked on Sjælland on August 16th, the straits were blockaded and all attempts at relief repulsed. Copenhagen braced for the inevitable. On September 2nd, a still night was broken by the thunder of cannon and the sky illuminated by the plunging arcs of Congreve rockets. Explosions enveloped the fort of Frederikshavn, protecting the eastern approaches to the port. The night attack initially took the Danish defenders by surprise, but they quickly rallied. Return fire was furious, and in the action several British ships were damaged. Under cover of darkness, the British withdrew, only to regroup and recommit in greater numbers. Over the next few days and nights this was the pattern, the British sailing in to pummel the defences and then pull back. Since the aim was to capture the Danish fleet, not sink it, they were careful not to fire blindly into the port. Fire from Carteret's disembarked cannon, though, was less discerning. Some of their fire overshot the escarpments to strike Copenhagen city. Flames erupted, leaping from building to building, until most of the city was engulfed. Hundreds of civilians not already evacuated were killed or maimed. By September 7th, the Danish had had enough. The French were still days away, defences were in ruins, and the capital a pyre. After the Danish surrender, the British withdrew, taking the surviving Danish warships on promise they'd be restored at the end of hostilities with France. The second bombardment of Copenhagen was a total military success for the British. At the cost of some lightly damaged ships and a few dozen dead soldiers and sailors, they'd captured intact the entire Danish fleet of 18 ships of the line and 30 smaller vessels. 3 of the ships of the line were subsequently scuttled, along with most of the useless smaller vessels, but either way it was a good haul. What's more, a permanent Baltic base was established in Sjælland as a forward base for the Royal Navy. Strategically, though, the results were universally negative. Denying powerful assets to the French necessitated a flagrant violation of Danish neutrality. Not only did this undercut British rhetoric as the defender of states downtrodden by Napoleon, this was the second time the luckless Danes had withered under British guns. It was hard to see Britain's gunboat diplomacy as anything less than the diplomatic strong-arming they accused the French of employing. Even the British public was aghast, juicing the peace movement. In the courts of Europe, the second bombardment was seen as an inflection point in British continental policy, where the Royal Navy could and would be employed where diplomacy failed. On September 30th, 1807, the French secured an alliance with Denmark. Napoleon wrote to Prince Frederick, quote, "Mon frère et cousin, I received your Royal Highness letter of September 12th. I have shared my sincere condolences for the misfortunes that Denmark has just suffered. It is regrettable that through cunning and bad faith, the English government misled the Danish ministers about the true dangers of the moment, for had part of your Royal Highness' army been in Copenhagen, things would have turned out very differently. But the past is without remedy. I rely on your energy and the bravery of your nation. I will gladly support your Royal Highness in all that you undertake to restore your country. To this end, I have given full powers to Ambassador Jaillot to conclude any agreement on this subject. I ask your Royal Highness to accept the assurances of my esteem and my unwavering devotion." An alliance with puny Denmark was hardly a great loss for Britain, and generally, Castle-ran Portland figured they could afford some bad press. This was a severe misjudgment that quickly isolated Britain from continental partners. Prussian ambassador to London, Constans von Jacobi-Kloest, issued his government's consternation and packed his bags that same September. Austria's ambassador, Ludwig Starhemberg, was not far behind, leaving in 1808. Neither were as resolved as Tsar Alexander, however. A stolid proponent of Danish neutrality, the British attack didn't drive him into French arms, but it did turn him sharply against the British at a critical moment. As per the terms of the Treaty of Tilsit, Russia was obliged to wage war on Britain in the event their mediation failed. The Russian ambassador to London, Maximilian Aloysius, was deep in peace talks when he was suddenly ordered to reverse course and issue stern denunciation of British policy. Canning demanded clarifications on the Treaty of Tilsit before talks could resume, while Aloysius demanded clarification on British intentions in the Baltic. For Alexander, it was impossible to interpret the bombardment and the base in Sjælland as anything less than veiled threats to St. Petersburg. Imperiling relations further was the question of Russia's Baltic ambitions. Napoleon had already assented to Russian claims in Finland, but Britain would back Sweden in the event of a conflict. If a compromise was possible before, none was now. Russia and Britain were on the well-trodden path to war. For Napoleon, the British attack was ideal. It drove Denmark into alliance, isolated Britain diplomatically, and spread a wave of fear among minor coastal states like Oldenburg that their own protection could only be guaranteed by French garrisons. It also helped that Britain was reacting with a heavy hand on the high seas in response to the Continental blockade. In the opening months of the blockade, Britain was more than willing to do trade with any ships entering or leaving French ports. The Treaty of Tilsit, combined with the worsening effects of the blockade, reversed this policy. Westminster revised their order in council that blocked all trade to French or French-aligned ports. Where before neutral shipping would be allowed to trade with France, provided they pay appropriate dues and submit to inspection, the revised order required neutral shipping to put in at British ports first. All goods bound for French ports would be tariffed heavily, discouraging trade with the continent. These revisions seriously threatened French commerce, as they relied heavily on neutral shipping. In retaliation, Napoleon issued the Milan Decrees in December 1807. The decrees doubled down on the Continental blockade, ordering that all ships which submitted to British searches or put into British ports would be denied entry to French ports. Furthermore, a new tranche of lettres de marque chummed the waters for French privateers. Between juggling domestic policy, relations with allies and enemies, and securing the continental system, Napoleon had a lot on his plate in 1807. Nothing, however, was as vexing or as infuriating as relations with Spain. To begin, it's best to go back a few years to understand both the Franco-Spanish relationship and the domestic situation in Spain leading into 1807. The headline is that Spain had never lived up to its potential as an ally. Instability, corruption, and chronic mismanagement had led to a period of protracted decline for Spain. Prime Minister Manuel Godoy has been blamed for Spanish decline after 1796. Though he certainly contributed, as we'll see, Spain's decline was a confluence of factors long in the offing and far beyond one man's control. Structurally, the Spanish state was weak. The central authority in Madrid controlled directly only the core territories once part of the Kingdom of Castile. Other regions were governed by Cortes, parliaments, that retained regional autonomy. The Cortes in Catalonia and Aragon were particularly independent, governing largely beyond Madrid's oversight. Economically, Spain had not developed along the same trajectories as those of its near peers in France and Britain. Whereas those economies had developed strong manufacturing sectors, Spanish revenue derived from tariffing its own expansive colonial empire. Bourbon reforms throughout the 18th century had tightened control over the wider empire, leading to widespread disaffection among Spain's southern and Central American colonies. And tempted as I am to name drop Simón Bolívar, Francisco Santander, José Páez, and José San Martín, tempted though I am to recount in glorious detail the growing independence movements and what would be, in a few short years, the independent republics of South and Central America, I'll limit myself to saying that all of Spain's colonies launched revolts and trade disputes that had forced Spain to consent to free trade, undermining its best source of income. With weakness of the administration, Godoy was forced to take massive loans from the French and issue a paper currency. Inflation skyrocketed and unrest grew. To make up the shortfall, Godoy nationalised as much church land as he could. For the pious Spanish, this was sacrilege, contributing to the growing unrest throughout the country. Then, as though heaven commanded, natural disasters ravaged Spain. Unseasonably hot summers caused droughts and several harvest failures. Outbreaks of measles and fever ripped through Andalusia and Castile. And in 1804, Granada and Murcia were rocked by earthquakes that killed thousands. In the midst of these ever-compounding domestic woes, Spain had to face the added pressure of being France's ally. After France's wars became Spain's wars in 1796 with the Treaty of San Ildefonso, Spain contributed cash and supplies in lieu of outright involvement. Once in charge, Napoleon demanded full belligerence. In 1801, the War of the Oranges had broken out over Portugal's refusal to abandon their British alliance. Godoy personally led the Spanish army during the invasion to occupy the municipality of Olivenza. But what Napoleon really wanted Spain for was its uncommitted navy, which was integrated into plans for a French return to the Caribbean and the ill-fated invasion of England. And we know how that one turned out. The Franco-Spanish fleet converted into a very expensive reef at Trafalgar, courtesy of the Royal Navy. For the French, the defeat spoiled a string of otherwise unblemished victories. For the Spanish, Trafalgar was the beginning of the end for the Franco-Spanish alliance. Godoy had long been opposed to further entanglement with the French, and since the early days of the alliance had been looking for a way to get out from under it, or at least do as little as possible. Most of these efforts were diplomatic. In the late 1790s, he tried to negotiate a withdrawal, but failed. To prevent active hostilities with the British, Godoy paid Britain an on-off bond for good behaviour, in return for non-belligerent status. By 1803, when Napoleon was putting the screws to Spain to intervene, Godoy tried to join the Russian-led League of Armed Neutrality, or else create one of his own. When war did break out, Godoy constantly sought a separate peace. Confusing Spanish policy further was Godoy's undermining of the Spanish army and navy. Since his objections to armed intervention rested on the unpreparedness of the military, he forestalled all naval construction and sabotaged requisitioning for the army. Open hostilities with Britain proved such a disaster for Spain that Godoy changed tack entirely. In 1806, he was actively preparing for war with a long series of military reforms. Supplies and monies were released, generals planned mobilization, surveys were made of border forts along the Pyrenees, and the Royal Guard halved to free up thousands of soldiers. Despite widespread resistance, conscription was extended outside of Castile. Under the pretense of aiding the French or suppressing rebels, the Spanish army was moved from its positions along the Portuguese border to the Pyrenees frontier. All that remained was to secure admission into the coalition and then strike. That moment had come, Godoy believed, in mid-1806 with the War of the Fifth Coalition. Like most of the courts of Europe, Godoy made the bet that the Prussians would body the French in the ensuing conflict. Napoleon wasn't oblivious to Godoy's belligerence. He could handle an unreliable Spain if it was stable, but he was a Spain both racked by revolt and bold enough to contemplate war. When pressed, Godoy disingenuously clarified that Spanish mobilization was in anticipation of Napoleon's demand for reinforcements. The ploy didn't fool anyone in Paris. The Spanish question rocketed up the list of Napoleon's concerns, but still fell short of a military solution given the active campaigning against Russia and Prussia. Instead, he opted to denude Spanish independence and freedom of action. He began by explaining to Godoy how he envisioned Spain playing a role in the defeat of Britain. Quote, removing the English from the continent, closing the ports to their trade, and denying their armies access to Hanover. This is the aim of the measures I have taken in Germany, and to which, in the very interest of His Catholic Majesty Carlos IV, I have wished to see his support. England's wealth grows only on the continent. To exclude her from it, to cripple her trade there, is to attack the very foundations of her power. That is where we must strive. That is where it is important to begin. Every event has its appointed time. They arise from one another and develop in a natural order. To try and hasten them to alter their courses is to jeopardize their success. A double-pronged approach, Napoleon also subtly dangled rewards for Godoy upon his ascent. Quote, it will be an honour for you to have contributed to such important measures beneficial to your country, and the bonds of friendship that unite me to His Catholic Majesty will readily make you understand that your Highness cannot render them important services without at the same time acquiring new claims to my goodwill. On December 15, 1806, a 15,000-strong army was demanded to guard the German coastline, in addition to the 6,000 troops already in Italy. Quote, by providing this corps, Napoleon told Talleyrand, Spain will not compromise itself with anyone because it will serve as an auxiliary under my command and gain the advantage of training soldiers. Godoy conceded, dispatching General Pedro Sordera, Marquis of La Romana, to command the División del Norte. In so doing, Godoy conceded the true point. The Spanish army was subordinate to French command. Military leverage was matched by financial leverage, only tightened with the annexation of the wealthy Tuscan kingdom of Etruria on August 29, 1807. Ostensibly, it was on the pretext that Spain was failing to repay its loans, and because the region was a hotbed for British smuggling. Though these were certainly part of the reason, the annexation forced the Spanish to rely solely on French loans going forward. Of no help whatsoever during all of this was the Spanish ruling dynasty, the Spanish Bourbons, absentee owners in their own country. The gout-ridden King Carlos IV ruled nominally, though Manuel Godoy governed. So followed the arrangement vis-à-vis the Queen, Maria Louisa. Carlos was married to Maria Louisa, Godoy slept with her. Without land or titles, Godoy owed his station largely to this affair, though it was also a source of constant trouble. For one, it alienated him from the nobility, who objected to royal favouritism and Godoy's centralisation. Even reformist nobles resented the ex-royal Garde. The affair with the Queen also made Godoy very susceptible to the vagaries of royal opinion. The French had proven adept at going over Godoy's head straight to Carlos or Maria Louisa when the Prime Minister proved truculent. Indeed, from 1798 until 1801, Godoy was out of power. He was reinstated at French insistence for the War of the Oranges. They realised that despite resenting French dominance, Godoy was at least capable of carrying out their orders. Even when Godoy defied France openly in 1806, it was impossible to oust him without also ousting King Carlos and Queen Maria Louisa. A power vacuum was intolerable, as it would invite more chaos as the royal family was divided over the succession. Prince Ferdinand, the eldest son of the king and queen, was in his early 20s. By all accounts, he was a fickle, stupid and vain young man. For these reasons, his father had isolated him at court best he could, even preventing him from commanding the Spanish army in Portugal. The loathing was mutual, and Ferdinand schemed against the king, queen and prime minister constantly. But he was the heir, and with the clock ticking for Carlos, it was likely Ferdinand would be king sooner rather than later. As such, he attracted the nebulous and multi-veined Spanish opposition, dubbed the Fernandinos. They included disaffected Catholics aggrieved at nationalisation, enlightened reformists demanding better government, absolutist army officers, and the various noble factions opposed, for one reason or another, to Godoy. Ferdinand's ascendancy would guarantee a period of infighting in Spanish politics that might plunge the kingdom into civil war. For as dire as things might have appeared in Spain, the spark that lit the flames of war in Iberia did not ignite there, but rather in Portugal, and to Portugal we will now turn. During the French Revolution and the Wars of the Coalition, Portugal was a belligerent but never stuck in. Though generally opposed to France and eventually the rise of Napoleon, Portugal neither had the military might nor the diplomatic heft to factor into anyone's calculations. Much of this stemmed from ongoing financial difficulties. Despite the dynamic early reign of Queen Maria I Braganza, Portugal was in slow financial decline as the value of its colonial imports steadily fell. By 1800, Maria had fallen prey to mental illness, and Portugal was officially ruled by a regent, Don João. Unofficially, though, Fecles João let the Prime Minister, António Araujo, govern. Araujo staked Portugal's future to Britain. He did not forsake the Anglo-Portuguese alliance when Napoleon demanded submission. Portugal was simply too dependent on British commerce, especially their taste for Portuguese wine. This all led to the War of the Oranges in 1801. As per the subsequent Treaty of Badajoz, Portugal cut all ties with Britain and paid France an annual indemnity. But emboldened by the defeat of the Franco-Spanish fleet, the Portuguese unilaterally abrogated the treaty in 1805. Invasion might have ensued, save that Portugal cleverly continued to pay the indemnity. With bigger fish to fry, Napoleon let Portugal be. They were to be put under the diplomatic screws by Andos Junot, Napoleon's envoy to Lisbon, but that was about it. As we've seen, the end of active hostilities in Germany and Poland, and Napoleon's return to Paris, signalled a change in policy towards Iberia. Portugal had by then defaulted on its indemnity payments, but this pretext was not alone the reason for Napoleon's high-handedness. Portugal represented a golden opportunity to at once strike a serious blow to Britain and strengthen France at their expense. Lisbon was Portugal's main entrepot into Europe, and an important staging point for the Royal Navy. It was also home to the Portuguese fleet, modest in size, but after the destruction of the Danish fleet, the largest and most modern uncommitted fleet in Europe. Napoleon wanted that fleet, and he wanted Lisbon closed to British ships. Napoleon renewed demands for Portuguese submission. On July 19, 1807, Napoleon ordered Talleyrand to issue an ultimatum to Lisbon. Quote, Prince of Benevento, it is essential to act without delay to close all Portuguese ports to England. The day after your arrival in Paris, you will inform the Portuguese minister that the ports of Portugal must be closed to England by September 1st. Failing this, I will declare war on Portugal, and English goods will be confiscated as security for what England owes Portugal. You will write to Junot in Lisbon to instruct him to make the same declarations. Caught in a horrific bind, Araujo pleaded with the Portland government to send help. Until it arrived, he would play for time. Portuguese negotiators met with their French counterparts in Paris, offering lavish gifts and bribes that succeeded in swaying several. Hampering French efforts further was Talleyrand's dismissal, as Champagny assumed control of foreign affairs in the midst of the crisis. The full extent of the foreign ministry's bungling was revealed as September 1st passed without the Portuguese submission. Enraged, Napoleon took direct control, in his typical overbearing style. On September 23rd, at a diplomatic soirée hosted by the Portuguese ambassador, Lourenço de Lima, the emperor denounced Portugal and reiterated his belief in French superiority. Quote, if Portugal does not do as I wish, the House of Braganza will cease to reign in Europe within 2 months. I will no longer tolerate a single English envoy in Europe. I will declare war on any power that has one at any time. I have 300,000 Russians at my back, and with a powerful ally can do anything. The English declare that they will no longer respect neutrals at sea. I will no longer recognize them on land. The tirade hit home for Araujo. At first, he sought a compromise that would please both sides. To the British, he promised the evacuation of the Portuguese fleet, continued trade in Brazil, and a lease on the island of Madeira. To the French, Araujo promised the expulsion of the British diplomat Percy Clinton, Viscount Strangford, the cessation of trade with Britain, and a declaration of war against them. Araujo's gambit failed to convince the French or the British, and was so poorly advised that Prince Zhao intervened to thwart its adoption. Even so, Napoleon would never have accepted. A second deadline of October 1st came and went. It was more than enough justification for war. In late September, the Emperor oversaw the preparations for the army that would invade Portugal. Euphemistically titled the Armée de l'Observation de la Gironde, there was no mistaking this for anything other than a force for conquest. The army was a reinforced corps d'armée, commanded by Général de Division under Junot, his chef d'État, Paul Thibaut. 1st Division was led by Henri-François de Laborde, 2nd Division by Louis-Henri Loison, and 3rd Division by Jean-Pierre Travaux. The Cavalry Division was led by Etienne Kellerman. 2 line artillery regiments formed the Artillery Division, commanded by Colonel Duance. A Colonel Vincent led the Engineering Company. In all, the army numbered 22,000 infantry and 2,200 cavalry. As a frontline corps consisting of several experienced regiments, Junot's force was expected to bear the load for the campaign. In support would be a second corps, the 2e Armée de l'Observation de la Gironde. This corps command was given to Général de Division Pierre Dupont, promoted from divisional command for his sterling performance in Germany and Poland. His chef d'État was François Legendre. Since the job was largely rearguard duties, Dupont's corps was not as large, around 12,000 strong. 1st Division was in the hands of Gabriel Barbeau, 2nd Division under Général de Division Dominique Vedel, 3rd Division was led by Général de Division Jean-Pierre Mallet. The corps' Cavalry Division was commanded by Général de Division Maurice Fraisier. The Artillery Division consisted of 4 line regiments and their guards, commanded by Simon Fautrier. A Régiment de Génie was attached to the corps, led by Jean de Bady. As we've seen, Junot was something of a fireman for Napoleon. From 1803 to 1805, he'd served very capably as the military governor of Paris, before being dispatched to Parma to suppress a revolt. He also served on several diplomatic missions, most recently in Portugal. As one of Napoleon's better independent commanders, Junot was reliable, but abrasive, combative, and prideful. No surprise he was nicknamed La Tempête, the storm or the tempest. Reputation aside, as ambassador to Portugal, Junot also honed a diplomat's tact. Napoleon assured Prince Regent Zhao that Junot was there to ensure that, quote, "Our 2 states will work together to achieve the great result of the balance of power at sea, which is threatened by the abuse of power and the vexations committed by the English." Of course, that was only half true. Secretly, Junot followed through on orders to assess the state of Portuguese armies and to draw up plans of their defences. At heart, he remained a fighting general. Junot felt that he should have been a marshal, but was denied the chance. Here in 1807 was the opportunity to prove himself to Napoleon on an independent command in a country he knew intimately. There was one hang-up though. Routes for the planned invasion of Portugal would take the army of the Gironde through northern Spain, so it was imperative that the Spanish be brought on side. For months, there had been ongoing negotiations between Champagny and Godoy over the scope of Spanish involvement. Initially, Godoy was reluctant to commit. France's annexation of Etruria had deposed Maria Louisa, Queen of Etruria, and daughter of Carlos IV. Additionally, the ouster of the Neapolitan Bourbons, combined with word that they might contemplate the surrender of Sicily under threats of French naval invasion, left Godoy feeling isolated. What induced him to support French schemes was the promise of compensation. Napoleon went over his plans with Spanish envoys. He intended to partition Portugal into 3 duchies. The north, around Porto, would go to Maria Louisa of Etruria. The centre, around Lisbon, the Bonapartes, and the south to Manuel Godoy himself, to be styled Duke of Algarve. With the promise of personal gain, Godoy was overjoyed. Here were the lands and titles he needed to secure his position in Madrid. King Carlos took more convincing. For several months, Napoleon had been love-bombing his chef frère. The aim was to convince him to assume a strong stance against Portugal, a task that assumed renewed importance with the second bombardment of Copenhagen. In a letter written on October 12, 1807, Napoleon began, Mon frère, at the time when Holland, the various princes of the Confederation of the Rhine, Your Majesty, the Emperor of Russia and I are all gathered to drive the English from the continent and to take revenge, as far as possible, for the new attack they had just committed against Denmark. Portugal has for 16 years been offering the scandalous conduct of a power sold to England. The port of Lisbon has been for them an inexhaustible source of treasure. They have constantly found all kinds of assistance there. Napoleon went on to promise Carlos, quote, suzerainty over Portugal will belong to you, as you seemed to desire. Practically, this meant the reinvestment of the king's daughter, Maria Louisa. For good measure, though, he also threw in a French guarantee for Spain's colonial empire and the right for Carlos to style himself, quote, Emperor of the Two Americas. On September 25, 1807, Spanish representatives in Paris signed on the dotted line the secret articles of what would become, officially, the Treaty of Fontainebleau on October 29th. By then, Dupin's corps had long since ranged into northern Spain, starting on October 18th. They occupied key towns and fortresses along the roads leading to Salamanca, where the bulk of the Allied Spanish army was staging. On October 29th, the full-scale invasion commenced, as Junot led First Corps from Bayonne across the border and into northern Spain. The plan was simple: advance with haste, rendezvous with the Spanish army, and then march hard and fast on Lisbon to either protect a friendly Portuguese government or install one. Secretly too, in a sign of things to come, Napoleon gave Junot orders to draw detailed maps of the Spanish territory through which they passed. Quote, draw up a description of all the provinces you pass through, the roads, the nature of the terrain. Send me sketches. Assign this task to engineering officers. Let me see the distances to the villages, the nature of the land, and the resources it offers. As for the main objective, Napoleon simply stated, quote, I have just learned that Portugal has declared war on England and expelled the English ambassador. This does not satisfy me. Continue your march. I have reason to believe that an agreement has been reached with England to allow time for English troops to come from Copenhagen. You must be in Lisbon by December 1st as friend or foe. Resistance was expected to be light. Portugal had at most 20,000 middling troops, and though the British expeditionary force was on its way, it was still recovering from the Danish expedition. The real problem would be weather. Despite travelling extremely light, Junot's advance was beset by problems. Spanish roads were few and badly maintained, terrain was rough, and rural areas poorly provisioned. Dupin's efforts at scrounging together food saved Junot's regiments from the worst of hunger, but could do nothing about the choking dust, biting cold, or worn-through boots. After regrouping in Burgos, Junot's divisions pressed on to Salamanca, reaching it on November 12th. They found all three Spanish divisions somehow in a worse state than they were. All the infantry regiments were under strength and undersupplied. Some artillery divisions had no guns at all, others only a handful. Disappointed in their allies, the French pressed on to Alcantara, arriving fully on the 19th as the stragglers caught up. No resistance was encountered at the Portuguese border, nor on the roads leading into Lisbon. All the French found was abandoned village after abandoned village. Evacuations had left entire regions depopulated, their storehouses emptied or burned, and the countryside stripped of fodder. To make matters worse, heavy rains turned mountain passes into muddy funnels. Rivers overflowed, and since the march could not stop for even a few hours, the troops had to swim. Hundreds died under these horrid conditions. Spanish troops fared even worse in their advance, moving to occupy the north and south. Entire regiments disintegrated as desertion and deprivation took their tolls. After 11 grueling days, 2,000 French troops, with Junot at their head, entered Lisbon. For all their endurance, it was a brutal gut punch to learn that it was all for naught. Ambassador Clinton, with increasingly desperate pleas, finally convinced the royal family, Prince João and Prime Minister Araujo, to evacuate to Brazil. They took with them Portugal's treasury and the war fleet. As revenge, the army of the Gironde looted Lisbon's monasteries and palaces. Overall, the French closed out 1807 in a strong position in Iberia. The invasion of Portugal was a qualified success, having achieved its military objectives, but falling short of the diplomatic ones. However, until Junot could establish the unassailability of the French position in Portugal, the country was not firmly secured, Likewise, the crisis in Spain was deepening. In coming weeks, hate-fueled rivalries in the Bourbon royal family would explode, plunging Spain into chaos as the Fernandinos sought to install Prince Ferdinand on the throne, and the incumbent Carlos fought to keep it. But there was a third possibility. Spain was too important for Napoleon to let it slide into chaos or civil war. The Bourbons could not rule. Perhaps the Bonapartes could.